Our riches and our numbers burden the world.
When essential raw materials like oil and copper run out, civilized life ends.
If we go on as we are, society collapses because we run out of metals and fuel. Growth is halted by a resource crisis.
Because land is no longer a limit to growth, industrialization rises to the point where, even with the pollution control measures we had before, pollution becomes a very serious problem and again brings about the collapse.
Hey, welcome back to the broadcast, all aboard the Meat Sauce Express. Today we're going to focus our attention on one article from Wired written yesterday titled, "The Planet Can't Sustain Rapid Growth Much Longer." The subtext reads, economic data expert Gaia Harrington says overconsumption has brought the world to a dangerous tipping point, but there's still time to act. For your information, Gaia Harrington, born 1981, is a Dutch econometrician, sustainability researcher, and women's rights activist. She's worked as a senior sustainability-related positions for some long name I can't pronounce, and holds a master's degree in both economics and sustainable studies. Her 2021 study on the projections made in 1972 sustainability report, The Limits to Growth, was widely publicized internationally. So, here we are in May of 2023, revisiting this revision of the original paper, Limits to Growth, which all of my subscribers are aware of. For the record, I'd like to read this so we're all on the same page. Come with me, take the journey. Half a century ago, a small group of esteemed thinkers that called itself the Club of Rome got together to chew over a thorny question. What would happen if humanity continued to consume the world's finite resources as if they were limitless? Their efforts generated the now famous 1972 paper, The Limits to Growth, in which they modeled what might lie in wait for humanity. It wasn't a pretty picture. The world, they predicted, was on a trajectory to overshoot its capacity to support continued growth at some point in the first half of this century. Continuing with business as usual, burning through resources while polluting the environment and pumping out carbon would result in a sudden and uncontrollable decline in food production, population, and industrial output by the end of the 21st century, or put simply, global collapse. Fast forward 50 years and humanity's still in deep trouble. In 2020, econometrician Gaia Harrington revisited and updated the Club of Rome's modeling to see whether we've shifted off this terrible trajectory and found that we've barely moved the needle. But while we're still on this dire path, all hope is not lost. Wired spoke to Harrington to find out what she might think happen now. Now, how humankind can safeguard its future and how we have a chance to step up and not just survive, but thrive. This interview has been edited for clarity and length. Wired asks, how would you describe humanity's chances right now of avoiding global collapse? Gaia Harrington, very succinctly, we are at a now or never moment. What we do in the next 5 to 10 years will determine the welfare levels of humanity for the rest of the century. There are so many tipping points approaching in terms of climate, in terms of biodiversity, so change our current paradigm or our welfare must decline. You cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. We do not have the option of growing forever. It's as simple as that. Wired asks, when you revisited the Club of Rome's work, you found that we haven't changed course over the past 50 years. If we continue as we are now, what's next? Everything is interconnected. We are very interdependent, so our economy is 100% embedded in society, and our society is 100% embedded in nature. In a system, when it starts to break down, you can see it start to flicker. So you have social crises, crises in governance, rising populism, and political violence, falling trust, and now, of course, an environmental crisis now. the flooding, and the droughts. Those are warning signs because the system is always trying to balance itself out to maintain itself. But you don't want to get to that tipping point. You want to heed the flickering. Ignore them, and in general, the world would be much less stable and pleasant because things like clean air, clean water, and nutritious food will be harder to get. It's hard to predict with precision for any location because we've never experienced this situation before, but parts of the world would become uninhabitable and we'd experience more intense and frequent weather disasters and crop failures. Mass migrations would likely grow in size and frequency, and of course there will be large inequities. Inequalities. It's not the groups that have contributed to climate change and ecosystem the most that will feel it the most. The people who are clearly causing the most carbon emissions are not necessarily living in the regions that are affected. Climate change will affect everybody, but we know that Asia is very vulnerable to rising sea levels, that Africa is going to have the most desertification. Wired asks, in your work, you analyze whether technology could help us avoid collapse. Is that plausible? Yeah, she replies, so you're talking about whether we could pursue a comprehensive technology scenario, in brackets, where unprecedentedly high rates of tech innovation come to the rescue. You hear these arguments a lot, but you don't really see it in the data. Research clearly points towards a business-as-usual climate collapse scenario because what's actually happening. Take our footprint, for example. We've been above Earth's carrying capacity since the 1970s, and that's taking in all of our ecological footprint, mining, fishing, farming, logging. Even if we just look at carbon emissions, which has been on the focus of innovation, even there's no absolute decoupling from the path towards collapse. There's a little bit, very tiny, not nearly enough, and we need absolute decoupling. That's nowhere in the data. And secondly, I think this is arguably more important. We don't want to be following the comprehensive technology scenario in the first place. It's not the best case scenario. I see here so often, we can innovate ourselves out of this. Even if we could do that, or even if we could, for example, reduce bees with robotic ones to fix a potential future collapse of pollinators, why would we want to live in that world? If we could also use our innovations in a way that doesn't have to resort to that. Wired asks, we've had warnings about our actions more than half a century. Why is humanity seemingly incapable of heeding them? She answers, we all have been taught that the only way to alleviate poverty is through growth, and that is simply not true. Plenty of studies show we can have everybody's needs met in a no-growth environment, but you cannot alleviate people from poverty without growth if the 1% hold on to all their wealth. So the alternative to growth is, of course, sharing more, but people are very loss averse. Once there's already a lot of inequality, there will be very powerful resistance from people at the top that have a large accumulated wealth and power, but we cannot grow our wealth beyond a point. So either we choose our limits, our own limits, and then we maintain our welfare levels, or we have limits to growth forced upon us through climate change and ecosystem breakdown. Wired asks, we need to stop kidding ourselves about unlimited growth and about what technological advances can do for us. But how specifically do we change? She answers, we have to really redefine who we are, how the world works, the world we want to see, and what our role is. A very important realization is that the current crisis, even the biodiversity crisis, is not just environmental or technological. If that were the case, it would have been solved by now. It's largely social and ultimately also spiritual. We should have a better vision. Then, of course, you need frameworks. Experts are already working on developing frameworks for well-being economics. The framework from Catherine Trebeck and others, or other frameworks such as donut economics and post-growth economics, they're not anti-growth. Rather, they distinguish between good and bad growth. If it supports human and ecological well-being, let's do it. Letting go of the pursuit of growth is not a capitulation to grim necessity. It's an invitation to strive for something better. The shift is really toward meeting everyone's needs, human beings' needs, but also for all life. And that would be a place where people are happier and nature is thriving, and I think it would be a better world to live in. Wired asks, is such a big transformation actually possible? Human history really is full of societies making drastic changes. It wouldn't be the first time the society bumps into limits and says we're going to do it differently. Of course, collapse is also not unprecedented, so that is no guarantee. People ask me, can we make the shift? Will we make the shift? I don't know if we will, because I don't know the future. I do know for certain that we can. We have the technological capabilities, we have the knowledge, and I also truly think that we have the will. Most of these measures that we talk about, post-growth economics, well-being economics, are wildly popular, and the recent Beyond Growth conference in the European Parliament shows how much this kind of thinking is gaining momentum, reducing inequalities, super popular, doing more to conserve nature. People hate that biodiversity is dying out. They don't like to hear the stories about another rhinoceros species dying, even though they probably had never seen one and they probably never would, but they deeply care about these things. One thing I liked about the pandemic is that it gave a very good recent example of this is what we can do. Clearly, if it's a necessity, we can do this. Wired asks, how useful are the efforts that are already happening, things like Convention on Biological Diversity, which is trying to fight back against biodiversity loss? It's a good question, she answers. It's very important. We clearly have undervalue nature. The challenges of falling biodiversity and environmental damage need to be tackled. They're global challenges. We need to be tackled on a global scale. We need those international agreements. The key with these things always is succeeding and always following up on your commitments. This one, the latest Convention on Biological Diversity, which first arrived in 1993, doesn't go far enough. It goes a lot further than the last one, so that is good. If you look at the scientific papers, 30 by 30, the pledge to make 30% of the world's protected areas protected by 2030 is probably not even enough. Work suggests we need 40 to 50%. At the same time, it's already much more ambitious than the last framework, and that was not achieved. So I think it's a good thing. I would like to see it go further, but it's absolutely a step in the right direction. Wired asks, alongside conventions, how much change has to happen at the personal level? It starts with the personal, she answers, but that is definitely not where it ends. It does not end with you recycling. These are systemic issues. An update last year from the Club of Rome identified 5 leverage points. Those are energy transition and food. We need to move to regenerative agriculture, and other 3 that are actually not environmental but social. Reduce inequalities between countries in the world, reduce inequalities within countries, and then gender equality is a massive leverage point in the system as well. So those would be the 5 areas you'd work in. Find your specific point in the system to work on with your capability, because everything is interconnected. If you work in a system, everything you do matters, and next to that, be plugged in. You need to go out and vote. It's not even about combating climate change or avoiding biodiversity loss or combating income inequality. It's kind of a battle for humanity's soul right now. Finally, Wired asks, are you optimistic about the future? Quote, I do genuinely believe that it's possible that we'll see a breakdown, and I just think that it will involve a lot of unnecessary suffering. I'm afraid of the heartbreak that it will cause. I'm a very privileged person. It will impact everybody, but it will not directly impact me the most. But I will have to see the suffering. That scares me. But I do think there's still hope. And I see so many people longing for change. When I see the younger generation, but not only the younger generations, I see a lot of people who are really energized and working towards a vision of a well-being economy, that in a society that's actually thriving. I see this more and more. I was quite surprised when my research went viral. I think it resonated with so many people because they already kind of had this sense like it's not working. And I think it's a very broadly carried sense that this current system, it can't possibly be the best version. Well written, well put. From Wired Magazine, the title of the article was "The Planet Can't Sustain Rapid Growth Much Longer." Thank you for taking this journey with me. I'd love to hear your input in the comments. I can already assume what some people might write, but maybe I know my subscribers too well by this point. I'll talk to you soon. See ya.